The 1950s would see one of the biggest horsepower wars of all time, and most American brands would more than double their horsepower over the course of the decade. Ford had been making a V8 for decades and had a well-established performance image, but for stock horsepower couldn't match the luxury brands. In 1950, a 239 cubic inch flathead Ford V8 was good for 100 horsepower, but this would soon change. Dodge would start the decade with a 230 cubic inch straight six that was introduced in 1949, producing 103 horsepower. Chevrolet introduced a new for 1950 enlarged version of their old Stovebolt straight six, now up to 235 cubic inches and 105 horsepower. Also for 1950, Pontiac's straight 8 was up to 268 cubic inches and 108 horsepower. DeSoto's 237 cubic inch straight 6 produced 112 horsepower starting in 1949. And Hudson was using the same 128 horsepower, 254 cubic inch straight 8 that had been its top engine since 1940. Oldsmobile's 88 is often credited, or blamed, depending on who you ask, for starting the 1950s horsepower war with its rocket V8s, although that only meant 135 horsepower when it was introduced in 1949 at 304 cubic inches. Starting in 1946, Chrysler's 224 cubic inch straight 8 also produced 135 horsepower, while Buick's 320 cubic inch Firebolt overhead valve straight 8 produced 152 horsepower starting in 1950. Lincoln used a 337 cubic inch V8, producing 152 horsepower starting in 1949. Packard was traditionally a horsepower leader and started out that way at the beginning of the decade with its 160 horsepower, 356 cubic inch straight 8 that had been Packard's top engine since 1940. But Packard wouldn't survive the 1950s. Cadillac's new 331 cubic inch V8 of 1949 also produced 160 horsepower, an engine and car that would find its way to a 16th place finish in the 1950 Le Mans. For 1951, DeSoto's straight 6 was up to 251 cubic inches and 116 horsepower. That same year, Pontiac's straight 8 was up to 120 horsepower, while the new Hudson Hornet's 308 cubic inch straight 6 produced 145 horsepower, and the Lincoln V8 was up 2 horsepower to 154. That year, Packard would drop its 356 straight 8, leaving the smaller 155 horsepower, 327 cubic inch straight 8 as the top engine, and Chrysler would introduce the 331 Hemi V8 with 180 horsepower. Many brands would get a horsepower bump for 1952. Ford's horsepower was up to 110. Pontiac got 2 additional horsepower, bringing it up to 122. And DeSoto upgraded to a 276 cubic inch V8 with 160 horsepower. Lincoln also upgraded their V8 to 318 cubic inches and 160 horsepower. And Oldsmobile's Rocket V8 was also up to 160 horsepower. But Buick's Fireball straight 8 was up to 170, and the Cadillac 331 V8 up to 190 horsepower. Dodge introduced its 241 cubic inch Red Ram Hemi V8 in 1953 with 140 horsepower, and Chevrolet's new Corvette with its Blue Flame version of the Chevrolet 235 straight 6 produced 150 horsepower compared to the 115 horsepower offered in other Chevrolet models. Oldsmobile got another 10 horsepower boost in 1953 to 170, and the Hudson Hornet straight 6 also increased to 170 horsepower. Packard's increasingly outdated flathead straight 8 was now up to 180 horsepower, and Buick replaced its overhead valve straight 8 with an overhead valve V8 at 322 cubic inches and 188 horsepower. And while Lincoln would increase its output to 205 horsepower, Cadillac would go even higher to 210 horsepower. Pontiac would get a 5 horsepower bump in 1954 to what was now starting to seem low at 127 horsepower, while Dodge's Mini Hemi would be up to 150 horsepower. The Chevrolet models would also gain horsepower, with the Corvette now being up to 155, while lesser Chevrolets to 125. DeSoto's Hemi would increase output to 170 horsepower that year, and the Oldsmobile V8 would grow to 324 cubic inches and 185 horsepower, while the Buick V8 would reach 200 horsepower. Packard would bump its straight 8 up to 359 cubic inches, raising the horsepower to 212, while Cadillac gained another 20 horsepower, reaching 230, but it was still surpassed by the Chrysler Hemi, now up to 235 horsepower. Nearly everything gained power for 1955. Dodge upgraded to a 270 cubic inch Super Red Ram Hemi with 193 horsepower, and Chevrolet introduced its now legendary small block V8 with up to 195 horsepower in the Corvette and 180 in the standard Chevrolets. Ford would go overhead valve in 1955 with its new 272 V8 with up to 198 horsepower in the new Thunderbird and 182 in the standard Fords. DeSoto would move to a 291 cubic inch Hemi with 200 horsepower, and Pontiac would also move to a V8 at 287 cubic inches and 200 horsepower, while the Oldsmobile V8 was now up to 202. Hudson returned to the 8-cylinder with a 320 cubic inch V8 producing 208 horsepower, and Lincoln's new 341 cubic inch V8 was still just above middle ground for this group at 225 horsepower. Buick was up to 236 horsepower with its V8. The Eldorado trim package had established itself as the top Cadillac for power by this point, with 270 horsepower for 1955, when Packard finally got a new overhead valve V8, producing 275 horsepower from its top 352 cubic inch version in the top-line Caribbean model. And Chrysler was so proud of the 300 horsepower version of its Hemi that they named the car they put it in the 300, a car that was aimed more at NASCAR dominance than the luxury car field. For 1956, Hudson would be up to 352 cubic inches and 220 horsepower. The Ford Thunderbird would have up to 225 horsepower from its 312 cubic inch V8, with other Ford models getting up to 215 horsepower. The 225 horsepower version of the Chevrolet V8 was now available in both the Corvette and the standard models. Oldsmobile's 88 and 98 would be up to 240 horsepower, while Buick's V8s would be up to 255. Dodge would move to a 315 cubic inch Poly or semi-Hemi V8 with 260 horsepower, and Lincoln increased to 268 cubic inches and 285 horsepower, while Pontiac was able to produce 285 horsepower from its 317 cubic inch Strato-streak V8. The Cadillac V8 would grow to 365 cubic inches and 305 horsepower. The last Packard Caribbean would go out with one last hurrah. It had a 374 cubic inch V8 producing 310 horsepower, an impressive number for 1956, but this would be one of the last of the so-called real Packards, and other lesser brands would soon surpass it. As the budget Chrysler, DeSoto was right on the heels of the 300, with a 341 cubic inch V8 producing 320 horsepower, while the actual 300, now the 300B, grew to 354 cubic inches and 355 horsepower. The top engine for the last Hudson of 1957 was down to 327 cubic inches, but horsepower still climbed to 255. The Chevy V8 would increase to 283 cubic inches and with optional fuel injection would put out 283 horsepower. The standard Fords of 1957 offered up to 245 horsepower, but more powerful versions of the V8 were offered in the Thunderbird, including a 340 horsepower supercharged version, while Lincoln's V8 reached the 300 horsepower mark in 1957. The same could be said for Oldsmobile, also reaching 300, and Buick's V8 would grow to 364 cubic inches and also 300 horsepower. Pontiac would offer mechanical fuel injection similar to Chevrolet's on its 370 cubic inch V8, producing 310 horsepower. Cadillac's Eldorado would gain another 20 horsepower to reach 325, and Dodge's Semi-Hemi would be up to 354 cubic inches and 340 horsepower, while the DeSoto Adventurer would offer a 345 Hemi with 345 horsepower, while the original Chrysler 392 Hemi would be up to 390 horsepower. By 1958, the horsepower war was settling down. The last Packard's top engine was a supercharged 289 Studebaker V8 with 275 horsepower. Ford's 300 horsepower 352 Interceptor V8 of 1958 to 1960 is often referred to as a Thunderbird engine, but it was offered in the standard models such as the Fairlane as well. Oldsmobile's V8 is now up to 371 cubic inches and 312 horsepower, and Chevrolet's bigger 348 cubic inch V8 was not offered in the Corvette, but had as much as 315 horsepower in the new Impala. Dodge's 361 Wedge V8 was offered with up to 333 horsepower, and Cadillac would gain another 10 horsepower in 1958, bringing the total up to 335. DeSoto would also get a version of the 361B Block V8, in this case producing 355 horsepower, and Lincoln would now be up to 430 cubic inches and 375 horsepower. There was actually some detuning being done in 1959, but Oldsmobile's V8 would grow to 394 cubic inches and 315 horsepower. A 325 horsepower, 401 cubic inch V8 would be Buick's top engine until the new Riviera model was introduced in 1963, and Cadillac power would continue to climb slowly up to 345 for 59 and 60. Pontiac would replace its fuel-injected 370 with a 345 horsepower Tri-Power 389 V8 that would later go on to power the original GTO. For 1959, the big Lincoln 430 would drop back down to 350 horsepower, while the Dodge Wedge V8 would grow to 383 cubic inches and 345 horsepower. That same engine in the DeSoto would produce up to 350 horsepower. And while the original Hemis were gone, Chrysler's top engine was a Cross-Ram 413 Wedge, producing 380 horsepower. In another year, horsepower would break the 400 mark, but wouldn't go up much from there, as focus would move more towards torque and smaller cars. As always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.